The scent of freshly ground coffee beans was my only comfort that morning. I drew in a deep breath as I prepared the intricate espresso machine at Café Bellamore, the upscale Italian cafe on the corner of Beacon and Charles where I had been working for 8 months. My fingers trembled slightly as I tamped the coffee into the portafilter, partly from sleepless nights, and partly from the weight of my father's growing medical bills, the rent notice already marked in red, and the slow collapse of everything around me. 6 long hours into my double shift, the soles of my feet screamed in protest with every step, yet I had no right to complain. This job, along with the few dollars in tips I earned, was the only thing standing between me and eviction from the shabby apartment my father and I still called home. I had learned how to be invisible among customers dressed in Armani suits and wearing watches that cost more than my car. An invisible shadow serving the drink they called liquid life, then disappearing before anyone noticed I was ever there. That's how they liked it, service without a face. I was arranging a tray with 3 cappuccinos when the air inside the cafe changed. The hum of conversation faded, then stopped altogether. A strange silence crept across every table, crawling up the book-lined walls and the Italian landscape paintings. The back of my neck tingled, the fine hairs on my arms standing upright, as if my body sensed the arrival of a predator. When I turned around, they entered. 3 men, dressed with the kind of precision that came from both wealth and discipline, walked in with a calmness that felt almost predatory. The 2 on either side moved like bodyguards trained to perfection, but it was the man in the middle who drained the oxygen from the room. Julian Moreau. He couldn't have been older than 37, with a face chiseled like marble, a square jaw, thick brows, dark slicked back hair, and eyes the color of molten amber. His charcoal gray tailored suit clung to his shoulders like armor. Every step measured, deliberate, weighted. He carried with him a kind of silence that had authority like a man who could stop time with a single glance. When those eyes swept across the room, I forgot how to breathe, and then they stopped on me right behind the counter. I didn't know why, but my heart slammed against my ribs as if it wanted to escape. I lowered my gaze, staring at the swirl of milk froth inside the metal pitcher, willing my hands not to shake. "Claire, table 7 needs pastries." Lisa, the morning manager, said right behind me, startling me so much I almost dropped the spoon. I nodded, grabbed a plate of croissants, and glanced at the clock. Not even 10 a.m. 8 more hours to go. As I walked the pastries out, I avoided looking at Julian, but even without seeing him, I could feel his gaze, an unrelenting stare that peeled back every layer of thought I tried to hide, and I was right. When I returned to the counter, Lisa rushed over, her face pale. "Claire, they're sitting at table 9, the one that's always empty. You're taking their coffee. Be careful. They're not like other people." I looked down at the tray of espresso I'd been preparing. 3 cups. 3 guests. "No need to ask who ordered what," Lisa whispered again, barely above a breath, as if saying his name too loud might shatter the air. "The one in the middle is Julian Moreau. He runs almost the entire Boston Harbor. His father died 3 years ago. Since then, no one dares to touch him." I swallowed hard. Julian Moreau. The name itself sounded like a curse whispered in midnight rumors, a man everyone knew, yet no one dared to name aloud. And now, he was looking at me, unblinking, unashamed. His gaze held mine as though it had weight. I picked up the tray, my legs suddenly heavy, and the walk toward table 9 felt endless. When I placed each cup in front of them, my hands trembled slightly, though my voice, somehow, did not. "Good morning. Would you like to try today's special espresso, gentlemen?" One of the guards nodded. I turned to leave, nearly exhaling in relief, when he spoke. His voice was deep and warm, yet so low that it demanded silence. "Who made this coffee?" I turned back, meeting the amber eyes locked on me. I drew in a breath and forced my throat to cooperate. "I did, sir." He tilted his head, the corner of his mouth lifting in something between a smile and a threat. "I see." That was all he said. No order, no compliment, just 2 words that sent a chill through me. My heart leapt to my throat. No one spoke, no one moved. The entire cafe froze in that single moment. I could only nod, and as I turned away, he lifted the cup, inhaled the aroma like a man tasting aged wine. I didn't look back, but I knew Julian Moreau's eyes were following my every step, and from that instant, my fate had already changed course. In that suspended moment, as Julian Moreau's gaze cut through Bellamore and found the barista struggling to steady her hands. If your heartbeat slowed with hers just a little, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share, so we can bring you more stories filled with emotion, tension, and intrigue each day. And before we move on to the next chapter where that gaze will no longer be coincidence but the beginning of a dangerous bond, tell us where you're watching from. Leave a comment with your city or country. Let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We can't wait to read your thoughts in the comments below. I returned to the counter, my heart still pounding wildly. Everything inside me seemed to move a fraction slower than usual. I grabbed a towel, wiping at the few droplets on the counter, though really, I was hiding my trembling fingers. The air inside the cafe hadn't fully returned to normal. Conversations had resumed, but in softer tones, and people exchanged discreet glances, as if silently agreeing to pretend they hadn't just witnessed a phantom of power walk among them. Table 9, the perpetually empty, almost sacred VIP table, was now occupied by 3 men who looked as though they had always belonged there. Julian sat at the center, his hand cradling the espresso cup like it was an extension of himself. He didn't drink. He merely turned the cup slowly between his fingers, his gaze never leaving me for even a second. That look unsettled me so deeply I had to turn away, keeping my eyes on the milk steamer as I cleaned it. Every time I looked up, the light glinted off the sunglasses of the guard on Julian's right, the one who had nodded on his behalf earlier. None of them showed any visible emotion, but everyone in the room knew exactly where they stood in the invisible food chain that ruled over Boston. The cafe door opened again. A middle-aged couple walked in laughing softly, but their laughter died the moment they saw table 9. The man gave me a polite nod, before steering his wife toward a distant corner behind the bookshelf. A chill ran down my spine. There was something about Julian that made people retreat not just out of respect, but instinct, as if his mere presence pressed down on the air itself. The cup in my hand was burning hot, though I couldn't recall when I had made it. I glanced at Lisa. She was hunched behind the register, pretending to count receipts, her eyes flicking nervously toward the table. When she noticed me looking, she shook her head quickly and buried herself back in the paperwork, as if numbers could hide her. I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched, it was the way Julian observed me, as though he already knew me from somewhere, as though I wasn't just another nameless barista. There are looks that shame you, looks that scare you, and looks that strip you bare layer by layer. His belonged to the last kind. I inhaled deeply, steadied myself, and kept working. I didn't know then that even though that day seemed like any other, my life had already taken a turn the moment he stepped through Bellamore's wooden doors. As I wiped down the espresso machine, my eyes caught his reflection in the glass display. This time, instead of looking away, I held his gaze not out of defiance or curiosity, but because I was simply tired of hiding. Julian tilted his head slightly, and I sensed the faintest shift at the corner of his lips. Not a smile, just an acknowledgement that he'd noticed. That small gesture sent a tremor through me. I couldn't tell whether it was a warning or an invitation, but it found a place deep inside me, where fear and desire quietly overlap. And I had no idea that this first exchange of glances, what seemed like pure coincidence, was the beginning of everything, a beginning from which there would be no turning back. Just as I turned to make a new latte, Lisa stepped up behind me and whispered urgently, her voice trembling under the weight of forced composure. "Claire, he asked for you." I turned, frowning slightly, my heartbeat quickening. "Who?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. "Julian Moreau. He wants you to bring the coffee. Only you." Lisa looked at me as if she had just seen a ghost, her wide eyes unable to hide the fear trembling behind them. I glanced toward table 9, and sure enough, Julian was staring at the counter with that same unnerving stillness, his espresso barely touched. I nodded without a word and began to prepare a fresh cup. My hands shook slightly, but I forced myself to focus on each movement, as if by following every familiar step precisely, I could somehow keep the world from shifting off balance. The coffee was brewed from the most expensive beans in the shop, the kind only regulars in the know ever ordered. I set the cup on a tray, adjusted the scarf around my neck, and began the slow walk toward table 9. The 3 men remained seated, saying nothing, though the eyes of the 2 bodyguards moved restlessly, scanning like machines. Julian's gaze, however, never wavered. Unblinking, unmoving, he sat with perfect posture, hands resting lightly on the table, as though waiting for something far more significant than a cup of coffee. When I reached the table, I inclined my head slightly, keeping my voice steady. "Your coffee, sir." I placed the cup before him. At that moment, one of the bodyguards extended a hand as if to take it, but Julian lifted a single finger, signaling him to stop. No one touched the cup, no one spoke. The silence stretched into something almost unbearable, a century compressed into seconds. Then Julian looked at me, his voice low, deep, each word articulated with unnerving clarity. "What's your name?" I hesitated for a heartbeat before answering. Claire Monroe." Julian nodded slowly. "I like the coffee you make." There was no flattery in his tone, only the quiet certainty of a man stating a fact. Every word he spoke carried an invisible weight, as though it could alter the air itself. "Thank you," I said, uncertain whether gratitude was appropriate. I turned slightly, ready to leave. When he spoke again, his gaze sharper now. "From now on, you'll be the only one to bring me coffee when I come here. No one else." I blinked, frozen in place, forcing myself to appear calm, though every nerve in my body vibrated like a wire pulled too tight. I wasn't sure I'd heard him right, or rather, I didn't understand why a man like him would care about something so trivial. I swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Julian smiled then, just barely. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had given an order and knew it would be obeyed. I stepped back, turned, and forced myself to walk slowly, though my heart was pounding like a drum. When I returned to the counter, Lisa rushed over, whispering with near panic in her eyes. "Oh my God, Claire, what did you do?" I looked at her and shook my head. "I don't know. I just made coffee." But even I didn't believe my own words, because there was something more in that look, in the way Julian watched me as if I were a mystery he had decided to unravel. And worse still, in that fleeting instant, I realized that a small part of me wanted to know who he really was. The rest of the morning passed in a strange haze. I kept working, kept brewing, kept cleaning, but every motion felt deliberate, careful, as though my body was aware of being watched even in his absence. Each time the door opened, I flinched, half expecting to see Julian's figure appear again behind the wooden door. But he didn't return that day, and though I tried to convince myself that it was for the best that it should be that way, I couldn't deny the quiet truth pulsing in my chest. It was the feeling of being seen, being chosen, being seen through, and knowing there was no way back. Like a coffee bean that had fallen into the grinder, there was no path to being whole again. Rain began to fall as I was cleaning the counter for the evening shift. The droplets tapped softly against the glass, each one landing with a steady rhythm that made the cafe feel even quieter. Through the misted window, I watched the streetlights cast golden reflections onto the wet pavement, stretching into wavering lines of light. The shop was nearly empty, save for two people in the corner whispering about politics in hushed tones. Lisa had already left early, leaving me to close up and check the machines. I didn't mind, even though my legs felt numb after more than 10 hours of standing. I had just turned off the sign when the front door creaked open. A gust of cold air and the scent of rain swept in, along with a figure I recognized immediately. Julian Moreau stepped inside, his dark coat damp with light rain, his hair slightly wet yet impossibly neat. He was alone, no bodyguards, none needed. The room seemed to shrink until it held only the two of us. I froze behind the counter, one hand still on the switch, my heart skipping a beat, as if it needed a second to understand what was happening. He walked toward me slowly, each step measured, echoing softly against the tiled floor. When he was only a few feet away, Julian stopped, his gaze, just like before, cutting straight through me. "Claire." His voice filled the quiet room, low and warm, like the opening notes of an old jazz record. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat suddenly dry. He glanced around the cafe for a moment before looking back at me. "Are you busy tomorrow evening?" I hesitated, my mind struggling to catch up. "Tomorrow evening? Do you mean... Is there something you need, sir?" Julian slipped a hand into his coat pocket and drew out a black business card, placing it gently on the counter. Silver letters shimmered faintly against the dark surface. Moreau Private Estate, Cape Cod. "I'm hosting a small gathering," he said. "Some special guests. I want you to make the coffee." I stared at the card, then at him, confused. "You could have someone deliver it from here, or hire a professional barista." Julian's expression didn't change. "I don't want anyone else. I want you." There was something in the way he said it that made my chest tighten. It wasn't a command. yet every word carried the kind of weight that couldn't be refused. I didn't know how to respond. I was just an ordinary barista, and I couldn't understand why someone like him would single me out this way. Before I could speak, he placed a thin envelope on the counter and slid it toward me. Inside were 5 crisp $100 bills, neatly stacked. My eyes widened, but before I could touch them, he spoke again. "That's a portion. When the job is done, you'll receive the full 5,000. My chest constricted. One night, $5,000. To me, that was an entire month of hospital bills for my father, 2 months of rent, a chance to breathe without the constant weight of debt pressing down on my shoulders. But why me? I asked, my voice hoarse with a mixture of emotion and disbelief. Julian studied me for a moment before replying, his tone so gentle it almost sounded like a confession. "Because you don't look at me the way others do, and because your coffee reminds me of my sister." I froze. For a fleeting second, his eyes softened, like ice beginning to melt. I didn't dare ask anything more. I only knew that if I refused, I would think about this moment forever, about his eyes, his words, that impossible offer. I nodded slowly. "All right, I'll come." Julian smiled then, a real smile this time. He left the card on the counter and turned toward the door, leaving it to close softly behind him. The rain kept falling, but I no longer felt the cold. All I could feel was the quiet certainty that my life had just turned onto a path from which there was no return. The black car glided along the winding road through the dark pines, its headlights slicing a ribbon of gold through the thin mist clinging to the ground. I sat in the back seat, gripping the bag that held my coffee tools, my palms damp with sweat despite the warmth of the heater. The driver said nothing the entire way, only glancing at me occasionally in the rearview mirror with a polite but distant look. When the massive iron gates came into view, I drew in a deep breath. The letter M, cast in gleaming bronze, curved elegantly across the gate like a royal crest. Beyond the trees stood the Moreau estate, grand, old, and imposing, like a European chateau lost in the woods near the Cape Cod shoreline. Golden light spilled from the arched windows, glimmering across the rain-slicked ground. I was led inside through a side entrance. An older woman in a crisp black uniform introduced herself as Mrs. Donato, the head housekeeper. She guided me to a smaller kitchen, where a miniature coffee station had already been set up. Everything new, spotless, and so meticulously arranged, it made me nervous. The party hadn't begun yet, but I could hear the faint strains of a string quartet playing Autumn Leaves from the main hall. I had just started arranging my tools when the kitchen door opened, and Julian stepped in. He wore a black suit with an open white shirt, no tie, his presence balanced somewhere between effortless elegance and quiet control. When his eyes met mine, the air seemed to slow. "Claire," he said my name in that deep, husky voice, warm and rough like the sound of wind sweeping across the sea at night. "Everything all right?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was breathing evenly. "Thank you for coming," he said. "If you need anything, tell Mrs. Donato." Then he paused, his gaze steady. "And don't worry, they won't let anyone bother you." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving behind a faint trail of cedar and smoke. It took me a few seconds to remember to breathe again. An hour later, the party began. Guests drifted in, men and women whose names I had only ever seen printed in newspapers. Politicians, bank directors, a former ambassador, and several figures from the upper tiers of finance. They were served by attendants in white gloves who moved like dancers, silent and precise. I stayed near the coffee bar by the tall glass doors overlooking the garden. Each time someone approached, I smiled, nodded politely, and fell into the familiar rhythm of work. Though my hands trembled slightly at first, the movement soon became mechanical, practiced. My eyes wandered over the crowd without purpose, until I met a gaze I already knew. Julian stood on the second-floor balcony, a glass of red wine in his hand, watching me. He didn't look away. He didn't pretend. When I looked up, he tilted his head just slightly, as if to say he was still there, still watching, that I belonged in this place, that I was somehow part of tonight. A strange feeling rose in my chest, not fear, not pride, but the quiet realization that I had stepped into a world I was never meant to enter. When I turned back to finish a cappuccino, I noticed my hands no longer shook. I was steady now, standing in the middle of an elite gathering inside the mansion of a man who, only days ago, had been a name whispered from afar. And he was still watching me. I didn't know whether it was an invitation or a warning, but I knew one thing for certain. I had crossed the threshold into a world that offered no return. The party ended close to midnight, yet no one seemed eager to leave. Small clusters of guests lingered near the fireplace. Wine continued to pour, and the sound of a piano floated down the long corridor lined with oil paintings and age. I was cleaning the last of my equipment when Mrs. Donato approached, resting a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Mr. Moreau would like to see you in the library," she said softly. "You can leave everything here. The staff will take care of it." I nodded, asking nothing, though my heartbeat quickened. The library was at the far end of the west wing, behind a heavy dark oak door with a cold brass handle. I knocked twice, and his voice came from inside. "Come in." The room opened in the warm glow of reading lamps and the quiet crackle of a low fire. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes, forming a labyrinth of history and thought. Julian stood beside the desk, his jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearms, the muscles in his wrists and hands outlined in the firelight. He gestured for me to sit in the leather chair opposite him. I stepped forward, willing my feet not to shake. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "My guests have never consumed this much coffee before." He studied me for a long moment, his eyes both analytical and unexpectedly gentle. I opened my mouth to offer a polite reply, but he spoke first, his tone calm and deliberate. "I have a proposal for you, Claire." I straightened slightly, instinctively cautious. "What kind of proposal?" He leaned forward. "I want you to be my personal assistant. Not for coffee. You'll work directly with me every day, regular hours, no late nights, nothing unethical. I'll pay you $15,000 a month." I thought I'd misheard him. Each word, each number struck my ears like pebbles skipping across still water, rippling outward in disbelief. $15,000 a month. For me, it was unimaginable. My breath caught as I clasped my hands in my lap. "I don't understand. Why me? I have no administrative skills, no financial background, no resume worth mentioning." He was silent for a moment, then his gaze softened. "I know more about you than you think." His voice remained calm. "An unfinished literature degree at Brown, 2 declined scholarships to care for your father, 6 years of part-time service work, without a single missed shift, no credit debt, you don't smoke. You haven't been in a relationship for 3 years. He recited it all without glancing at a single document. My throat went dry. I didn't know whether to be afraid or strangely seen. "May I ask?" "Why?" I managed to whisper. Julian leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced. "Because I need someone who observes, someone honest, and someone who isn't afraid of me. You have all 3. I sat there in silence, weighing every word. Part of me saw an escape from the tightening noose of debt that had defined my life. Another part sensed that this was no ordinary job, that the moment I said yes, something irreversible would begin. "If I accept," I asked quietly, "what would I be doing?" "Each day begins at 8, he said. "You'll accompany me to meetings, read documents, take notes, arrange schedules. You'll be under full protection, and no one will have authority over you but me." "And if I refuse?" I asked. He paused, then smiled faintly. "Then I'll keep coming to Bellamore and waiting for your coffee. But it would be a disappointment." For a brief moment, he didn't look like a dangerous man. He looked like someone profoundly lonely, trying to hold on to something real in a life long swallowed by shadows. I didn't know if I believed him, but I knew I was tired of living in fear of tomorrow. I lifted my gaze to meet his. "I'll try for 1 month." Julian nodded, then stood, extending his hand toward me. "A fair beginning," he said. I placed my hand in his, and that handshake, what seemed like a simple agreement, was, in truth, the first signature on a pact with a world that offered no way out. The next morning, I handed in my resignation at Bellamore. Lisa looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern, asking if I was in some kind of trouble. I simply smiled and told her I had received another offer, a better one. I didn't go into detail, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because even I couldn't yet define what kind of place I was stepping into. That afternoon, right on time, a silver-gray car arrived to pick me up at my apartment. The driver, a dark-skinned man with a close-cropped haircut, who introduced himself as Marco, spoke little and kept his eyes on the road the entire way. I sat in the back seat beside a canvas bag containing a few neat changes of clothes and my worn-out notebook. Through the window, Boston slowly receded behind us, giving way to tree-lined roads, old stone walls, and finally the Moreau gates appearing once more, no longer mysterious, but inevitable, as though I had been meant to return. Mrs. Donato greeted me in the foyer with a polite nod and led me down a long hallway toward the main staircase. My room was on the second floor. At the far end of the corridor, a heavy wooden door opening into absolute quiet. Inside was a refined space of beige and olive tones, a bed with crisp white sheets, a window overlooking a mist-covered garden pond, a small desk, a low bookshelf, and an old leather armchair that looked like it had been lifted from a film in the 1940s. I stood in the center of the room, unsettled. It wasn't a hotel, nor exactly a home. It felt like a waiting room between two worlds, one I had never belonged to, and one I was not yet ready for. At precisely 8 the next morning, I stepped into the library where Julian was already seated behind his desk, dressed in a white shirt and a loosely knotted black tie. He gestured to the chair across from him. "From now on," he said, "everything passes through you before it reaches me. Schedules, documents, invitations, personal appointments." I nodded and opened my notebook. "You don't need to understand everything yet," he continued. "But you need to observe, and you need to be honest." I wrote down each word carefully without asking for clarification. We worked straight through for 3 hours without a single break. I watched as he spoke to 3 different men on the phone, one in Italian, one in French, and another in a heavily accented Eastern European English I could barely follow. Julian never explained what those calls were about, and I never asked. Near noon, he took me to a small conference room in the basement, where a large map of the city lay spread across the table, marked with red, blue, and yellow pins. I stood there silently, unsure what I was witnessing, only knowing that it bore no resemblance to any office job I had ever imagined. Lunch was served in the glass house at the back of the estate, among rows of lavender and lemon trees. Julian poured me a cup of black tea, and after a pause asked, "Do you regret it?" I met his gaze, no longer avoiding it. "Not yet, but I know that feeling could come at any moment." He nodded, unsurprised. "Are you always this honest?" I smiled faintly. "I'm not good at pretending." Julian leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "That's why I chose you." The afternoon passed in a blur of documents delivered from various sources. I was introduced to 2 other employees who worked downstairs, Ruth, who managed finances, and Kenny, who handled logistics. Both were polite and discreet, the kind of people who had long accepted that silence was safer than curiosity. That night, when I returned to my room, I opened the window and looked out at the garden bathed in cool darkness. Soft amber lights lined the stone path below, and there, beneath the large maple tree, stood Julian alone, without a phone, without guards, his shadow stretching long across the grass. I didn't know how long he had been standing there, or what thoughts held him still, but in that moment, I understood that some people carry silences so deep they feel like oceans, and I was slowly, willingly, walking into that depth. I soon realized that the Moreau estate was not merely a residence, but an ecosystem unto itself, closed, precise, and governed by an unspoken order so disciplined it required no written rules. Everyone within its walls had a clearly defined role, moving with quiet efficiency and almost ceremonial precision. The staff never interrupted without being summoned. No one asked unnecessary questions, and every glance seemed trained to look away at exactly the right moment. Mrs. Donato, the housekeeper, was the soul of the place. She never raised her voice, yet her presence alone kept everything in perfect rhythm. Each morning, a handwritten schedule was slipped under my door, neat, sharp, and deliberate, like the woman who wrote it. Breakfast was served at 7 in the smaller kitchen, attended only by 3 core staff members. They always greeted me with a nod, spoke little, but there was a wordless kindness in the way they placed a steaming cup of tea or a plate of warm bread in front of me. My room was the only space in the mansion that no one could enter without permission. I had my own key and a magnetic card granting access to the main workspace on the 3rd floor, an area reserved exclusively for Julian and me. The hallways were always hushed, carpeted thickly, lit by the soft glow of old brass sconces that made time itself seem slower. I often saw Marco in those corridors, sometimes murmuring into a phone, sometimes opening the door to the wine cellar. He would greet me with a brief nod, his expression composed, as if he had long forgotten what it meant to relax. There were also 2 other men who frequently appeared at Julian's side, Thomas and Elias, one tall and lean, the other shorter and solidly built. both carrying the guarded look of men who had seen too much of the world's darker corners. I was taught a few unwritten but mandatory rules. Never leave the estate after 8 p.m. Never use a personal phone in the third-floor workspace. Never ask questions unless asked. And never open the last door at the end of the east hallway. No one explained why, and I didn't ask. My curiosity wrestled with caution, but something in the air told me that certain doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Each workday began at 8. Julian and I spent hours in the library or his private meeting room. He spoke little, yet every word demanded attention. Some days we reviewed contracts, other days we went through lists of names and locations whose connections I dared not guess. He didn't hide his work from me, but he never elaborated unless I asked. It was a strange kind of trust, not bound by promises, but by silence, a silence that tested you. In the evenings, when the day ended, I stayed in my room reading from the library shelves or writing notes about what I had learned. Though I still understood so little, I forced myself to memorize the unspoken rules, the recurring names, the subtle changes in expression whenever someone new entered a room. Gradually, I came to realize that this was more than Julian's home. It was the control center of an entirely different world. A world where power was not shouted but exchanged quietly through firm handshakes, layered glances, and coded gestures. Once, leaving work later than usual, I heard the faint sound of a piano from the main hall. When I went down, I saw Julian seated at the old instrument, his shadow long across the marble floor, playing a nameless melody that was slow and deep as winter wind over the sea. I stood in the darkness of the corridor, afraid to interrupt. He had never mentioned that he could play, just as he had never spoken of himself more than necessary. But in that fragile moment, when every wall around him seemed to fall away, I understood more clearly than words could tell me. Though I was only at the beginning, I had already stepped fully into a world unlike any I had ever known. And with each passing day, I was disappearing from the life I once had piece by piece. Julian never raised his voice, yet every word he spoke made the entire room pause. His presence carried a distinct gravity, not loud, but so palpable that anyone facing him instinctively straightened their posture, measured their tone, even adjusted their breathing. What unsettled me most was not the power he wielded, but the way he kept a deliberate distance enough not to overwhelm, yet never enough to let me retreat. In work, he was exacting. Whenever I handed him the wrong document or failed to prepare something precisely as requested, he never scolded me. He simply looked at me with such calm restraint that I felt my own shame more keenly than any reprimand. Once, I mixed up the time of a meeting with someone named Rourke, causing Julian to arrive 15 minutes late. He said nothing then, handled everything as if no interruption had occurred. But when we returned to the library, he set his schedule book quietly on the table, looked at me, and said in an even tone, "Next time, don't make me correct your mistakes." It wasn't a threat, but the weight of it kept me awake the entire night. I learned to take more careful notes, to check every detail 3 times, to prepare for every contingency. Julian never repeated an instruction. He expected understanding without reminders. Yet he was also the first to ask if I'd eaten when he noticed my focus waver from low blood sugar during a long meeting. He was the one who brought me a cup of hot ginger tea when I'd been coughing for 3 days. And he was the only one who noticed when I cried silently in my office the evening I learned my father's surgery had been moved up. That night, when he saw my swollen eyes, Julian didn't ask questions. He simply closed the door, drew the curtains, and poured a small glass of whiskey. "Drink," he said quietly. "Just tonight. Tomorrow, we go back to work." The words carried no pity. They felt like a gentle touch against my palm on a winter night silent, but enough to remind me I wasn't entirely alone. Once, I accidentally left confidential documents in the meeting room, and one of the lower-level staff saw them. Julian summoned me to the library, his voice so cold it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. If that hadn't been someone from inside the house, the consequences would have been far worse. You need to understand here, even the smallest mistake can carry an enormous price. I nodded, offering no defense. He studied me for a long moment, then exhaled. "But I believe you've learned. Next time, don't make me choose between you and the safety of everyone here." I left the library that day with heavy steps but a mind sharper than ever. Julian was not merely a leader. He was a man whose trust came not from words but from granting you the chance to make things right instead of casting you out. On rare days without work, I'd see him stand for hours in the greenhouse, hands in his pockets, gazing at the lavender blooms with an expression that seemed lost in a memory both distant and ancient. One night, after waking from a nightmare, I stepped into the hallway for water and found him sitting alone in the library, the reading lamp casting soft light over his clasped hands, resting on an unopened book. When he saw me, he didn't look surprised. He simply nodded, a small gesture inviting me to sit if I wished. We sat like that for nearly an hour, neither speaking, and strangely, that silence made me feel safer than any words could. Julian had edges unseen by most layers of emotion so deep that without patience, you'd only encounter the coldness of his walls. But once past them, you realize that beneath all his control and discipline was a man holding his wounds together through mastery of restraint. Perhaps real gentleness lived within that control, not in words, but in those quiet moments when he allowed me to exist inside his world without needing to prove myself. The distance between Julian and me was always maintained by a line, invisible yet unmistakable, never spoken, never defined, only felt through the way he looked at me and the way I learned to read the silences between us. At work, we formed a strange, seamless rhythm. He never had to repeat a command. I always knew what to prepare, where to place the files, when to leave, and when to stay. A language without words grew between us, communicated through glances, small movements of the hand, subtle nods that carried both authority and a rare kind of respect. But outside of work, Julian became something far more complicated to me. He never tried to be close, never crossed any lines, yet his presence surrounded me softly, constantly, as if I lived within his field of awareness, within his thoughts, even when nothing was said. Once, while rearranging documents in the library, I dropped his fountain pen. The sound was barely a click on the marble floor, yet it seemed to echo through the stillness. I bent to pick it up, and when I looked up, Julian's eyes were already on me, not angry, not reproachful, but filled with an attention so steady my heart skipped. For a fleeting moment, I felt like the sole focus of a perfectly silent universe. Moments like that were rare but recurring, just enough to keep me wary of my own emotions. Another evening, during a late working dinner, I instinctively pushed away a plate of grilled fish prepared for him, remembering he was allergic to seafood, something I had picked up from a passing comment between two staff members. I didn't think twice. It felt natural. But when I placed a different dish in front of him, Julian looked at me for a long time, saying nothing. That gaze carried more than gratitude, it held a quiet wonder, as though he himself was questioning when someone last cared enough to notice the smallest details of his life. I turned away before that look could linger too long. I didn't know whether I was trying to keep distance or afraid I no longer could, because even without ever touching me, Julian made me feel as if I stood dangerously close to something that could no longer be called safe, something that, if I stepped toward it, I would never return from. One night, after I finished a financial report and was about to leave, his voice stopped me. "Claire." I turned. He stood by the tall window, the light from outside outlining the sharp edges of his face. "Do you believe in coincidence?" I hesitated. "Depends on what kind of coincidence." My voice was quiet, fragile in the still air. "The kind that concerns you and me," he said. "Why you came here? Why now?" I met his eyes, a chill running through me. "I don't think it's coincidence," I said softly. "It's timing, something we never really control." Julian nodded slightly, as if he'd expected that answer. In that brief instant, the distance between us could no longer be measured in meters or words, but in something far more elusive, a depth of feeling without a name, yet unmistakable as breath, and that made it all the more dangerous. That night, I returned to my room with a feeling I couldn't name. I stood before the mirror for a long time, searching my reflection for signs of something shifting, perhaps in my eyes, perhaps in the way my fingers brushed the inside of my wrist where a touchless gaze had left its trace. And I realized then that what frightened me most was not Julian himself, but the fragile, shrinking space between power and emotion, a distance growing smaller each day, quietly, steadily, like the rhythm of a heartbeat I no longer dared to listen to. That afternoon, while I was reviewing the guest list for the gala Julian was hosting at the estate, Mrs. Donato knocked softly on the office door. In her hands was a long wooden box wrapped in black velvet. She said little, only placed it on my desk, offered a faint smile, and left. On the lid rested a small card, written in deep blue ink, the slanted handwriting elegant and familiar, like Julian's own voice captured on paper. "I want you to represent me tonight, and I want every eye to know it." Inside lay a sapphire blue silk gown, fitted gently to the body, with a draped neckline and a low, precisely cut back. The fabric was cool as water, so soft that when I touched it, it seemed to erase the boundary of my skin. Accompanying it were silver heels and a pair of delicate pearl earrings. Everything fit perfectly, so perfectly it felt either that Julian had known my measurements all along, or that fate had tailored the dress for me in this very night. When I descended the grand staircase at 7 o'clock, every gaze, staff and security alike, lifted toward me for an instant. I had never worn a gown like that before, never let my hair fall loose in soft waves across my back. And when Julian turned at the end of the hall, dressed in a black tuxedo with pearl cufflinks, I saw something unmistakable shift in his eyes. He walked toward me slowly, as though nothing else in the house existed in that moment. "Claire," he said, only my name, nothing more. But in the way his gaze traced from my eyes to my shoulders, pausing for a heartbeat at the hollow of my throat before returning to meet mine, I knew I had crossed into another realm of feeling that required no acknowledgement to be real. The gala took place in the mansion's great hall, its ceiling soaring nearly 14 feet high, crystal chandeliers glimmering like falling stars, the hum of live jazz weaving through the air. Guests arrived in evening attire: politicians, financiers, old money families shaking hands, smiling, lifting glasses of red wine in silent ceremony. I stood beside Julian, no longer merely an assistant but part of the image he intended the world to see. He didn't need to introduce me. The way he stood near me, the subtle closeness between us, the way he occasionally leaned to murmur something near my ear, intimate yet measured, all of it, told the room who I was. When the band shifted into a slow ballad, Julian turned to me and extended his hand. When I placed mine in his, the world outside dissolved. He led me onto the dance floor with the steady ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times. His hand rested lightly against my back, not too near, but no longer distant. I looked up, meeting his eyes again, and this time nothing stood between us. There was no work, no roles to maintain, only two people standing in a room filled with light, soft music, and hearts beating slower for something both ancient and achingly real. I don't know how long the dance lasted. I only know that when the music stopped, his hand was still on me, and I didn't want to step away. Throughout the evening, no matter how many people approached him, shaking hands, speaking in polite tones, laughing softly, I could always feel his gaze on me from somewhere, like a thin, invisible thread stretched between us, silent but undeniable, vibrating with every breath. That night, when I returned to my room, I didn't take the gown off right away. I stood before the mirror for a long time. The woman reflected there felt like a stranger, eyes luminous, cheeks flushed from the wine, a faint smile lingering from the last note of music. I placed a hand over my chest, where my heartbeat still thrummed like the echo of a piano chord. I knew then that something had begun, and this time, it wasn't about work, it wasn't about money, it was about a gaze that no longer hid. Everything that followed happened too fast, as though someone had sliced through a tranquil painting with a blade of ice. The gala was still unfolding, the soft jazz, the autumn light rhythm, my half-finished glass of wine in hand beside Julian at the edge of the dance floor. The chandeliers still shimmered, the laughter still floated, and then suddenly silence. A short, sharp pause, like the room had stopped breathing. Then glass shattered, a deafening crack, gunfire, a scream. Chaos erupted in a storm of sound and movement. Before I could think, Julian turned, his arms sweeping around my shoulders, dragging me down to the floor. He shoved me behind a long table draped in white linen and heavy with the scent of flowers and perfume, then stepped forward, shielding me with his body. Marco and Elias appeared from nowhere, drawing guns from inside their jackets, their eyes scanning every corner of the room. Julian said nothing, but his gaze cut through the chaos, his face carved from stone, his body tense as a wild animal sensing its predator. Another bullet tore through the glass ceiling, hitting the floor where I had been standing barely a minute earlier. Screams echoed. Guests scrambled for cover. Gowns and tuxedos crumpled in panic beneath the swinging crystal lights. Julian turned back, his eyes locking on mine, not calm, not cold, but fierce, commanding. "Claire, come with me. Now." I stumbled to my feet, still in shock, and he seized my hand, pulling me toward the side corridor behind the great wooden doors. Marco covered our rear. Elias led the way, the three of them moving like a single organism of precision and force. We burst through a reinforced door and down a narrow staircase, each step echoing with a hollow metallic sound. My heart pounded not from running, but from seeing, for the first time, the true face of the world I had entered. Gone were the quiet meetings, the soft music, the deep, unreadable glances. Now there were only guns, smoke, fear, and blood waiting just beyond the next door. Julian pulled me into a small, reinforced room, slamming the bolt into place before turning to me. His eyes were different now, no panic, only focus, and something else, concern. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, but before I could answer, his hand brushed my cheek, wiping away a thin line of blood where a shard of glass had grazed me. I couldn't tell whether I was trembling from fear or from the warmth of his touch. Julian turned to Marco, his voice low and metallic. "How many? What direction? What's the situation outside?" "3 shooters," Marco replied tersely. "From the outer gate. Someone inside opened the way. Could be an insider." Julian's hand tightened into a fist, his expression darkening. "Tell Thomas to assemble the response team. Send Elias upstairs, seal every exit. We stop them before they reach the main hall." Marco nodded and left, leaving me and Julian in the narrow room, lit only by a single flickering lamp. He sat beside me, silent for a long moment. I looked at him and saw that his hand resting on his knee trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. I had never seen him like this, not weak human, not the man of power who always knew the next move, but a man fighting to protect what mattered to him. At any cost, I reached for his hand, this time the one to initiate. He looked at me, and in that instant, every boundary between us dissolved. There was no superior and subordinate, no past, no title, only 2 people sitting amid gunfire and chaos, holding on to each other like a silent vow that no matter what came next, we had found one another, and we would not let go. I was brought back to the estate around 3 a.m, in the black armored car that Marco drove himself, the streetlights fading behind us like blurred streaks of memory through the fog of exhaustion and lingering fear. The night sky felt heavy, thick, as if it were holding all sound above the still line of trees. When the mansion came into view, it was no longer glowing with its usual brilliance. Only a few dim lamps glimmered behind half-drawn curtains, casting a faint golden haze over the silence that felt almost cold. My palms were slick with sweat despite the chill as I stepped inside, my chest still tight from hours wound taut as wire. "Mrs. Donato was waiting in the foyer, her face set, her eyes filled with worry and something close to pity. "You should rest a bit," she said softly. "Everything will settle soon." I nodded mechanically, unsure how to answer. Marco said nothing, merely gestured to 2 guards to take their posts at the entrance, then walked away, his broad frame disappearing down the dark corridor like a silent phantom, keeping order in a world on the verge of chaos. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heels suddenly feeling as heavy as stone. The silk gown Julian had chosen for me still clung to my body, creased, dirt-stained, the hem torn near the side seam. I didn't change. I simply sank into the chair, arms wrapped around my knees, staring blankly at the pale square of the window. I hadn't asked where he was going. I only knew he had left the shelter the moment he knew I was safe, taking Marco and his men with him. He hadn't said when he would return, nor what might happen next. He had only looked at me once, that look carrying both command and promise. But now, with the clock striking 5 and the weak light of dawn touching the walls, I began to fear that the look might have been the last. That for the first time in my life, I had placed my faith in someone with nothing to hold on to except the feeling itself. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I didn't speak to anyone. "Mrs. Donato brought me tea, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Every sound in the house seemed swallowed by a silence that stretched and stretched, as if the entire mansion were holding its breath with me. Then, just as the first rays of morning slipped through the window slats, I heard the sound of an engine outside the gate. No one needed to tell me. I stood at once and ran down the stairs, my heart pounding wild against my ribs. Julian was being helped in by 2 men, his white shirt soaked with blood along his left arm, his face pale from pain and exhaustion. Yet the moment he saw me, he lifted his head, as though the first thing he needed upon returning was to make sure I was still there. I ran to him without thought, without restraint, blurting out, "Where are you hurt?" He shook his head, lips pressed tight as he fought the pain. "It's nothing serious. I'm all right." Marco signaled to the private doctor who followed behind. They took Julian into a small chamber next to the library, a room I had never been allowed to enter before. I waited outside, hands clasped together so tightly they felt cold and bloodless. When the doctor finally emerged nearly an hour later, Julian called for me. He lay on a long sofa, his shirt removed, white bandages wound around his shoulder, his face pale but his eyes still steady and bright. I sat beside him, trying not to cry, but my throat was locked tight. He looked at me for a long time, then reached out suddenly and took my hand. "You waited for me." It wasn't a question. It was a quiet certainty, spoken so gently and firmly that I could only nod. I had waited, and I would keep waiting, not out of duty, not out of fear, not because of the role I played, but because I no longer had a choice, because the man before me was no longer Julian Moreau, the cold, commanding figure I had once feared, but the one my heart had found its way to, piece by piece, without permission, without hesitation, and without regret. I didn't leave that room the entire morning. Julian lay on the long couch beneath a thin blanket, the light from the window tracing every line of his face, the weariness around his eyes, the white bandage on his left shoulder still stained faintly with blood, and those steady eyes that never once drifted away from me. I sat beside him in silence, pouring water, adjusting the pillow, sometimes brushing my fingers lightly against his hand, just to be sure he was still there, still warm, still real. Near noon, when things finally quieted and the doctor said his wound would heal within a few days, I began tidying the scattered papers on the small table, moving slowly, not wanting to leave the fragile space suspended between us. Julian said nothing, but his gaze followed every step I took. Then suddenly, just as I turned to reach for the teacup, he spoke my name. "Claire." I froze, the porcelain cup hovering midair. His voice was lower than usual, not commanding, not distant. "I've never believed in weakness," he said quietly. "But when I saw you waiting all night, something inside me, everything I'd built to protect myself, cracked open. You know, for the first time in my life, I didn't want to hide anymore. I didn't want to pretend I didn't care, or to seem cold, or in control. I just wanted to tell you that I've thought about you more than I've ever thought about anything." I walked back to him, set the teacup down, and sat beside him again, my eyes locked on his. He hesitated, then lifted his right hand, the uninjured one, and touched my cheek, his fingers trembling slightly. His voice fell to a whisper, as if he feared I might disappear if he spoke too loud. "I can't stop anymore. I tried. I drew the line. But you crossed it without even trying." I didn't know what to say. My heart felt as though it were breaking open for something soft and terribly real. I placed my hand over his, still resting on my face, and whispered, "I can't stop either. I'm afraid. But I still choose to stay." Julian smiled then, one of those rare smiles that softened every sharp angle of his face. He leaned forward slightly, his breath warm against my skin. "What are you afraid of?" he asked. "I'm afraid that loving you will cost me everything I've ever believed was safe," I said. "But I'm more afraid of not loving you, of not seeing you every day, of not knowing how you look when you're tired, or silent, or in pain." Julian lowered his head, the distance between us now barely a breath, and then, slowly, gently, his lips touched mine. It wasn't urgent, it wasn't possessive, it was an acknowledgement that we both knew this would change everything, and yet we chose it anyway. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but inside it was an entire world. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his voice hoarse. "You are the only peace I know," he whispered. "If you're here, I can face everything else." I wrapped my arms around him carefully, mindful of the wound. He held me not tightly, but with a kind of surrender that told me he was no longer holding anything back. In that small room, amid the remnants of a chaotic night, we found each other not through grand declarations, but through presence itself. No one needed to say more. No promises were required, because from that moment on, every question already had its answer. I woke later than usual that morning. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, gentle but not gentle enough to quiet the thoughts spinning restlessly in my head. I had fallen asleep in Julian's room, curled up on the sofa beside his bed, my hand clasped around his through the night as if letting go even for a moment would dissolve everything into a dream. He was still asleep, his breathing steady, his face calmer after a night of fighting pain and fever. I slipped out quietly, barefoot along the empty hallway, my mind heavy and clouded. No one stopped me, no one asked questions, only the sound of the wind drifting through the tall windows and the golden light stretching across the cold stone floor. I went down to the library and sat at the familiar desk where I had first worked beside him, staring at the rows of neatly arranged books, remembering the meetings, the contracts, the unspoken nods of approval, the silences that had carried more meaning than words. But for the first time since I stepped into this house, I no longer felt certain not about him, but about the world he belonged to. The attack last night hadn't been an accident. It was the result of overlapping alliances, betrayals, and the kind of quiet wars waged in a world that had no mercy for the faint-hearted. Julian had shielded me from it for a while, but not forever, and I couldn't pretend not to see anymore. I thought of the secret calls, the nights he left without saying where he was going, the reports listing names and places I once assumed were tied only to business. Now I knew everything here had a price: safety, power, trust, and I began to wonder if I could survive in a place like this. I hadn't grown up around guns or blood. I had never imagined the man I loved would live on the edge between law and shadow. I was afraid not of Julian, but of the world he was bound to. Afraid that love might not be enough to keep me steady when everything around us could crumble from a single mistake. I was lost in that thought when Mrs. Donato entered, carrying a tray of tea as she always did. She set it down, looked at me for a long moment, and spoke softly. No one who lives in this house has never felt uncertain, not even Julian, but he chose to protect rather than withdraw. I looked up at her, at the deep, knowing eyes of a woman who had seen far more than I could imagine. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. The question isn't whether you're strong enough to stay. It's whether you love him enough to face the darkness that comes with him. When she left, I remained there, her words looping through my mind again and again. I loved Julian. That, I was sure of. But was love enough to make me accept a life where nothing was guaranteed? Where nothing could ever be called normal? I thought of his eyes the night before, when he said I was the only peace he knew, and I realized he had never asked for forgiveness, never begged me to stay. He had only offered me truth, an unguarded gaze that carried both vulnerability and invitation. That kind of trust was its own form of surrender. It wasn't a chain, but it left no way back. I still didn't have a clear answer, but something was taking shape inside me, something that felt like commitment, not because I had stopped being afraid, but because I was beginning to understand that real love isn't about escaping fear, but choosing to stand beside the one you love even while trembling. And perhaps that day, I took my first true step into his world not as an assistant, but as a companion. That afternoon, I walked out to the garden behind the mansion, where a row of old olive trees shaded a long wooden bench, looking for a quiet moment to steady myself. The sky was overcast, yet light streamed softly through the branches, tinting the world in warm, muted gold. I carried a notebook not to write, but to keep my hands from shaking. Marco appeared behind me not long after. He wasn't in his usual guard's attire, just a dark shirt and slacks, his tall frame moving with unexpected quiet. I startled when I saw him, but he smiled gently, a gesture that told me he meant no harm. He sat down beside me without a word, his gaze fixed on the trembling leaves above us. Then, in a low, steady voice that felt like the wind itself, he said, "You know, Julian once had a younger sister. Her name was Isabella." I turned to him, surprised. Julian had never spoken of her. Marco didn't look at me. His eyes were far away, as though seeing something that lived only in memory. She was 8 years younger, the only person who could make him laugh without trying. He raised her like his own child, taught her music, taught her self-defense. He even planned to take her out of the country, to keep her far from all of this, but they never made it. I was silent, my heart tightening with a sorrow I couldn't name. Marco's voice stayed calm but carried the weight of years. It was an internal conflict. She was targeted as leverage to break him. He got there too late. When we found Isabella, she was gone. I swallowed hard, the fragments of his words stitching together into a picture of unbearable grief. Marco closed his eyes briefly before continuing. After that, Julian changed. He stopped trusting anyone, stopped letting anyone close. We rebuilt everything from nothing, but he hasn't truly smiled since. Not until you came. I stared at him, unsure I'd heard right. He nodded slightly, still looking ahead. "Since you arrived, I've seen the change. It's not what you said or did, it's your presence. The way he looks at you reminds me of Julian from 10 years ago, when Isabella was still alive." My throat ached, my body frozen in that moment. Marco leaned back against the bench, his eyes closed. I help him not out of blind loyalty. I stay because I owe him and I owe Isabella. But I've been watching you. I've seen your fear, your hesitation, and the quiet strength that's replaced it. You could have left, but you didn't. And for that, I'll stand with you. Whatever happens, if you ever need someone to protect you, just ask. I won't let tragedy repeat itself. I didn't know when the tears started falling, not out of pity for Julian or Isabella, but because for the first time, I truly understood why, among all the people he could have chosen, Julian had chosen to trust me. In his eyes, I wasn't a replacement for what he'd lost, but a final chance to rebuild what remained. Marco gave my shoulder a brief, firm pat before walking away, his figure fading into the deep green of the garden. I sat there for a long time, watching the leaves tremble in the wind, feeling a sorrow that ran deep but not hopeless. I knew then that from this day forward, I was no longer merely someone who had wandered into Julian's world by accident. I had become part of what he was trying to protect with everything left in him. And I would not leave, not because love was enough, but because the choice had never been clearer. I packed my things in the middle of the night. Not much, just a few simple clothes, my notebook, an old camera, and the book I still hadn't finished. I folded them neatly, my hands trembling slightly but without tears, without the shock or confusion of earlier days, only a deep quiet inside me pulling toward the door. When I went downstairs, the mansion was asleep, the long halls dimly lit, faint lamps casting pale reflections across the cold marble floor. I left no note, said nothing to Julian, to Mrs. Donato, or to Marco. I only wanted to disappear. I didn't try the main foyer. Instead, I slipped out a side door into the cold garden, my small bag clutched in my hand. I kept to the shadows, my heart pounding, until I reached the massive iron gates. A single guard, bundled against the cold, watched me from the guardhouse. He didn't move to stop me. Perhaps he had orders not to, or perhaps he simply assumed I was no threat. He just pressed a button, and the heavy gates groaned open. I stepped out onto the long, winding private road that led away from the estate. The cold night air hit me immediately. I pulled my thin coat tighter and just started walking, the sound of my own footsteps loud against the asphalt. I walked for perhaps 20 minutes, the lights of the mansion disappearing behind the dark pines. I was heading for the main highway, where I thought I could eventually call for help, or just keep going. I didn't know where I would go, only that I couldn't stay. I didn't belong to this world, a place where every feeling had to hide behind armor, where love was always shadowed by danger, where an embrace could be the last, where trust always stood beside betrayal. But as I walked, the cold seeping into my shoes, I looked down at my hand. The faint red mark was still there, where Julian's fingers had gripped mine the night chaos struck, and the warmth of that last embrace in the library still lingered on my skin, and I knew I couldn't do it. I stopped in the middle of the dark, empty road. I couldn't leave as if nothing had ever happened. I couldn't abandon the man I loved, the man who had already lost everything, and had only one thing left unbroken me. I couldn't walk out of his life without fighting for it. Slowly I turned around. The walk back felt twice as long, every step heavy with the new certainty of my choice. By the time I reached the gates again, dawn was beginning to rise. The same guard watched me return. He didn't look surprised. He simply opened the gates again. I crossed the silent foyer. No one spoke. No one stopped me. The stillness carried an uncanny knowing, as if everyone had expected me to return, just not when. I climbed to the third floor, to the balcony overlooking the back garden. Julian was there, wearing a white shirt, his right shoulder still bound in a light bandage, his hair tousled as though he hadn't brushed it. He didn't turn when he heard my steps. He only said quietly, "I thought you'd gone," as if to Muster. I moved closer, standing beside him, my hands gripping the cold railing. "I did," I said, but then I realized I couldn't. Julian turned to look at me, something between relief and pain flickering in his eyes. "Why?" he asked. "Because if I left, I'd have to live the rest of my life with the question of whether I abandoned someone who needed me most at the moment he couldn't find the words to ask. Because I don't want to love you from afar, or remember you as a memory. I want to stay and fight beside you, for you and for myself." Julian said nothing. He only stepped forward, touched my face the way he had that first time in his office, and drew me into a long, quiet embrace. "Do you know what you're choosing?" he asked softly. "I do," I whispered, "and I accept it, because this time I choose not to run. He didn't make promises, didn't say it would be safe or easy. He only nodded and held me closer, as though he were holding the most fragile, precious thing he had ever owned. And I knew, in that moment, that we were no longer two people separated by walls of restraint. We were one facing forward, ready to endure whatever price love demanded. And that was not just a choice. It was the true beginning of something that would never turn back. On a gentle morning in early autumn, sunlight poured softly through the trees in the garden behind the mansion as I stood on the stone steps, watching Julian carefully tend to the outdoor grill. The scent of marinated meat mingled with the crisp air and the crackle of glowing coals, calming me like a stream flowing over the edges of an old memory. At the long table draped in a checkered cloth, my father sat talking with Mrs. Donato, looking healthier than I had seen him in years, his cheeks flushed pink from the wine and sunlight, his eyes bright like in the days of his youth. After months of worry, hospital bills, medicine, and uncertain diagnoses, he could now walk the garden paths on his own, pour his own drink, even joke about his thinning hair, as if the shadow of illness had finally lifted after a long sleep. I sat beside him, resting my hand lightly on his thin but still warm. He turned to me and gave my hand a squeeze, his smile as tender as when I used to run home from school as a child. "Are you happy?" he asked. The question caught in my throat. I nodded, my gaze drifting toward Julian, the man I loved, the one who had quietly cleared the path for what once seemed impossible. He had never sought credit, never made me choose, just stood there, steadfast as an old oak tree, sheltering every scar inside me and my family alike. Marco brought out a tray of lemonade and beer. Elias joked as he tended the skewers. Laughter mingled with the rustle of leaves and the scent of lunch rising through the golden air. Mrs. Donato appeared with a bowl of cold salad sprinkled with cheese, setting it on the table with the reverence of ritual, before joining my father to talk about the herbs she grew in the far corner of the garden. I had never seen him laugh so much. He spoke of my mother, of the simple years when love was a walk in the park or an afternoon tea by the window. I listened, smiling through tears, realizing something profoundly quiet, that no matter how the world changed, even when life was surrounded by secrets and danger, happiness could still exist here. In the midst of it all, Julian came over, laid a hand on my shoulder, said nothing, just a gentle squeeze, and I understood. He was sharing the moment with me not through words, but through silence that spoke of everything. When we finally sat to eat, everyone lifted their glasses, not in grand toasts or hollow wishes, but with shared glances and simple nods of truth. The meal unfolded in laughter, in broken stories and warm familiarity. I saw Julian truly laugh when my father told how he'd once nearly been arrested for growing tomatoes on a rooftop without a permit. Saw Marco grin when Elias recounted being mistaken for a teacher on his first day of school. Saw Mrs. Donato sigh when I confessed to burning the first loaf of bread I ever tried to bake here. The sun tilted westward, gilding everything in soft gold, stretching our shadows long across the stone terrace. I leaned my head against Julian's shoulder, his fingers intertwining with mine under the table, hidden, but sure. No one spoke, but we all knew. This moment, this gathering, was something none of us had believed we would ever have again. And there, in that ordinary afternoon, I understood that love doesn't need grand promises or expensive gifts. It only needs a quiet day, where those once broken can sit together, share a simple meal, and see the light return to each other's eyes once more. That afternoon, after everyone had finished cleaning up from the outdoor gathering, Julian and I walked along the narrow stone path leading toward the slope behind the mansion, where the horizon glowed crimson beneath the light of the setting sun. The sky blazed like a painting made of fire and gold, the wind moving gently through the trees, creating a soft, whispering sound that felt like nature itself was speaking to us. We said nothing, just walked quietly side by side, hand in hand, the warmth of his palm spreading through me in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new, as if I were realizing for the first time where I truly belonged. When we reached the highest point of the hill, where the trees rolled down in layered shades toward the valley below, Julian turned to look at me. His eyes no longer held the sharpness they once did, nor the lingering sorrow from the stories of his past. They were calm, clear, like the sky after rain. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze and said, his voice deep yet steady, "You are my peace." The words caught in my throat not because they were sweet, but because they carried the weight of everything we had been through. Through all the struggle, confusion, and loss, what remained was the quiet truth that peace comes from being beside the one you love, when your heart finally rests where it belongs, free of doubt. I rested my head on his shoulder, and in that moment I understood that everything that had happened was never a test of endurance. It was life's way of asking whether love was real. Julian had chosen me, not because I was different, but because I had dared to see him as he truly was, and stay. And I chose him because I saw the good that still existed within the complicated world he carried on his shoulders. That was what kept me from leaving. If you're watching this video, perhaps you've journeyed with us through every moment of this story, the fear, the hope, the hesitation, the quiet joy when they finally held each other's hands at the crossroads of fate. Tell us how you felt, down in the comments below, because your voice, your truth, gives stories like this their meaning. Maybe, in your own life, you too have loved someone whose world frightened you. But sometimes what makes love grow isn't the perfection of the person you love, it's your own courage to stay. The story of Julian and Claire isn't just a love story. It's a reminder that even in chaos, the most precious thing we can find is the peace we create in one another. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video so more people can experience stories filled with emotion and humanity like this one. Every interaction from you, every click, every comment gives us strength to keep bringing meaningful, heartfelt stories to life every day. Tell us, did this story remind you of something real from your own life? Or is there something you'd like to see in our next videos? We would love to hear your honest thoughts. Thank you for spending your precious time with us until the very end. We wish you good health, serenity, joy, and fulfillment in every single day of your life. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.